Yascha Mounk, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So I want to start talking about Russia, of course. It's the big topic, and you're a global guy, but you have spent a lot of time commenting on this crisis. And one thing you've said that's been notable, I thought, was that Putin has basically stopped even trying to pretend that he's not flouting international norms. This is a guy that always wanted to build a Potemkin democracy, wanted to at least pretend that they had the norms, that they had the trials and all the rest. You're saying he's not doing that anymore. What do you think caused that change? When did it happen?
Well, I think it's a broader change what we're seeing in Russia, but also in other countries. So we're now in the 16th year of a democratic recession, the 16th year that in a row that more countries have moved away from democracy than have moved towards it.
This is the Freedom House Index, for example. We see that every single year. Fewer democracies in the world, democracies becoming more hybrid and more authoritarian.
Exactly. And I think we think about this in terms of a lack of democratic self-confidence. We think of that in terms of domestic threats to democracy, like Donald Trump was in the United States, like many other politicians are, like Viktor Orban in Hungary. But one big thing that has happened is really a authoritarian resurgence. The growth of confidence of people like Xi Jinping in China and like Vladimir and Putin in Russia, who are saying, we no longer have to pretend to play by the rules of the United States, by the rules of the West, by the rules of what we used to call the liberal international order. We will actually just be honest about our demands on the international stage and our lack of respect for human rights and lack of respect for any semblance of democracy domestically. And this, I think, is really transforming Russia in a worrying way from something that was always dictatorship, it was a dictatorship 10 years ago, to an even more repressive regime in which naked power is even more central.
Because in China, of course, Xi Jinping actually believes that ultimately his system is a better system, where in the case of Russia, Putin certainly doesn't have illusions of that.
Well, I don't know whether or not he has illusions of that. I certainly think that Putin says and believes that the West is decadent, that traditional values are undermined in the West in worrying ways, and that actually the kind of strong leadership that he provides and the kind of supposed defense, at least, of traditional values that he provides is important. I never underestimate people's ability to be the heroes in their own stories. And I'm sure that Vladimir
Bin
Putin,
Laden was the hero of his own story. I mean, if you want to go that far, sure,
absolutely.
I agree with that.
And I'm absolutely sure that Vladimir Putin thinks that he is serving the grandeur of a Russian nation, and that while he's allowing himself a little yacht here and a little bit of corruption there, this is ultimately in the interest of his people.
Well, no, part of the reason I say that, though, is because in the case of Russia, right, the country's in decline. It's been humiliated. He's been humiliated. Why? By the West. And a big part of the reason that we see this attack is to redress those grievances.
Yes, it is a way of saying, you have humiliated us. Famously, Putin thought that the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Well, this is an attempt to rebuild a new Russian empire.
Why do you think he's gotten it so desperately wrong?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, he got it wrong. A lot of Western observers got it wrong too. I think most quote-unquote serious people thought that Ukraine would fall within days and that Russian tanks would be in the streets of Kiev, within a week of the beginning of this cruel war. I think we all underestimated the courage and the capability of leadership in Ukraine. I think we also underestimated just how deeply corrosive corruption is, how deeply corrosive a kleptocratic regime is, not just for the ability of Russia to innovate or to have billion-dollar patents or to have develop its human talent,
but for its military strength.
For its military, for its actual ability to make sure that tanks don't get stuck because they haven't been oiled properly.
And how do you think this is likely to play out, not just for Russia, but also for China, which is doing far better economically, which is not a country in decline at all, and yet has made this fateful decision to throw their lot in with Putin right at this moment?
Well, I mean, clearly China has walked a careful line where they are giving some support to Russia, but they haven't done anything which would trigger the West to seriously decouple economically. Of course, the big question is whether the Chinese leadership is watching this with regard to Taiwan and whether they are seeing what Putin is doing in Ukraine as a kind of test run for whether or not they should use military means to reunify the country.
In which case the lesson would be no?
One should hope that the failure of Putin to do this in Ukraine and the serious economic consequence that Russia would have to pay is an effective form of deterrence, which makes Beijing think perhaps the price for doing this in a military way is too high, and perhaps the risks are bigger than we appreciated. That may not be the case. They may look at Russia and say, Russia is a declining nation. It is, ironically, a decadent nation. We are much more capable and competent, and the price for the West of imposing similar sanctions on China would be much, much higher for them as well. So we can nevertheless go ahead. But there's at least a possibility that some of the decision makers in Beijing are looking at what's happening to Russia and the Russian elite and thinking, we don't want the same thing to happen.
I mean, I appreciate that you're hopeful about this, and it's a good place to be. And your book, The Great Experiment, ultimately is also hopeful. And I think that, and I'm glad for it. I'm glad for it. But as you say, we have increasingly been in this democratic recession. And living in the United States, it's not just an awareness of the ways in which the system is screwed up. It's also increasingly an awareness that it's getting more screwed up every year, right? So what is for you the likely turning point that makes us start to recognize that we can be a little less screwed up?
Well, one of the things is that this growing international competition may, in fact, provide a little bit more unity. I think one of the reasons why we were relatively able to deal with our strong internal divisions through the Cold War was the knowledge of the threat from autocratic countries. And I think as this sort of strange little holiday from history, which countries did enjoy or thought they enjoyed after 1990 ends, we may be able to find some kind of common resolve. But the challenges are real, right? And the challenge that I talk about in my new book, The Great Experiment, is about the really historically unprecedented challenge of building deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that actually treat their citizens as equals. Most diverse societies in the history of the world have gone deeply wrong. Most democracies in the history of the world have been quite homogeneous or have treated members of minority groups as second-class citizens or worse. What we're trying to do here really is a new challenge, and it could go wrong. And the price to pay if it does go wrong is very, very high. We know what it looks like when diverse societies fall apart, and it is not pretty. It is bloody. It is horrible. But nevertheless, I do think that we also have real strengths. So when we look at what the United States, what Germany, what Australia look like today compared to 25 or 50 years ago, they are actually doing much, much better at building these diverse democracies than most people predicted a few decades ago.
Can you say that the United States is doing a better job building its democracy today than was predicted 25 years ago?
Well, I'm speaking specifically about the question of ethnic and religious diversity. I think in the question of how do we deal with this transition of a society in which one group really was dominant, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the past, in which they enjoyed very deep advantages over every other group, in which other groups were both numerically much smaller than they are now and subordinate in a way that they no longer are. I think on those counts we really are making very big progress. So let me just give you a few examples of that. The first is that racism was quite open and very widespread in the past. 50, even 30 years ago, a majority of Americans openly said that they think that interracial marriage is wrong. Today, that is in the single digits. It used to be that about 1 in 33 marriages were interracial. Now it is about 1/7. So the number of mixed-race kids has gone up very, very rapidly. So prejudice is much lower than it was.
And yet black wealth in the United States is just off the charts horrible compared to white wealth right now. And so how can we explain why you would be more tolerant in terms of, again, intermarriage between races, but that you would see this yawning gap in terms of wealth accumulation and economic capacity?
After centuries of that kind of system of injustice, it is unsurprising that the descendants of that system continue to have much less wealth, for example, than descendants of people who have been able to go about economic productivity and freedom for centuries. But there too, it is important to see the nuances. So wealth takes longer. The gap in income has substantively reduced over the last decades. And black women born into the poorest quintile of the population, for example, actually have more socioeconomic mobility than white women who are born in similar circumstances today. There is a real pocket of poverty because of the long-term structural impacts of all the injustice in American history. But the modal experience of African Americans today is hopeful. And actually, when you ask African Americans how they feel about the American dream, how they feel about the future of America, they are more optimistic than white Americans.
I'm wondering, for those in democracies that are watching what's happening in Russia, and Russia's falling apart right now, and that are watching what's happening in China, and China with a very different system is doing quite well economically and in other ways, which is the more powerful lesson, and what kind of lessons are being taken away in democracies today?
Well, I think one of the lessons that we should take from the pandemic and the last few years is that we need to become more serious about solving our problems, that we are in a real ideological competition with autocratic countries, though we're seeing in Russia and North Korea, in Ukraine, what it means to live under an autocratic ruler or what it means to be subject to the power of these resurgent autocracies. So we all should want to make sure that the 21st century remains safe for democracy, that these fundamental values of individual freedom and collective self-determination actually win the day. But to do that, it's not enough to wax poetic about our beautiful values or to rely on the idea that somehow our system has always proven strong in the past, so it's going to do so again. We need to make sure that our system actually delivers for its own citizens and remains a model where people in rising nations like India, like Nigeria, like Kenya, look around the world and say, we would rather be more like Germany or the United States than like Russia or China. And that is up to us and the decisions we make here.
Now, the end of the 20th century was safe for democracy. Looking forward, increasingly, you would argue, and I agree, that the 21st century increasingly is less safe for democracy. If it turns out that we fail, that the great experiment fails, why will that have been?
I think for two reasons. The first is that there is a basic human instinct towards groupishness. There's a basic instinct to form groups and to discriminate in favor of the members of the in-group and against the members of the out-group. This is particularly salient in ethnically and religiously diverse democracies, where it's very easy to say, I don't care about being American, I care about being X, Y, and Z. Now, thankfully, there is a way to respond to that, which is that it depends on the social context, on the framing, on the incentives, what groups you give importance to. And I think if our societies fall apart, it's because we end up giving more importance to our ethnic belonging, to our cultural roots, or to our partisan identity than to our common interests, than to the things that we actually share as Americans here in the United States, as Germans in Germany, as Indians in India. And so I think if we fail, it's because a lot of the institutions that are influential in society, from politics to education to the media, haven't tried hard enough to emphasize the importance of discovering and seeing those commonalities.
That was reason one. You said there were two.
Well, the second goes to partisan identity. When the founding fathers started the first great experiment, in a way my book is about the second great experiment, when they founded the United States, it seemed like a foolhardy project. When you looked around in 1776, there really weren't many countries that had succeeded in governing themselves because people formed these groups, not necessarily ethnic or religious groups, but just partisan groups of one family, one clan, one party, one faction fighting the other. We have a set of institutions to try and manage that tension, but it always depends on the choices of individuals. on how we frame our politics, whether we manage to stop those factions from becoming so bitter that they would rather win against their enemy than preserve the system. And so the two great dangers is that we fail to build diverse democracies that work, that manage to build commonality between different ethnic and religious groups. And the second is that the partisans of one political party become so obsessed with victory, vilify their partisan opponents to such an extent that they're willing to blow up a system to gain power or to remain in power.
Yascha Mounk, his group is American. His book is The Great Experiment. Thanks for joining on GZERO World.
Thank you, Ian.